And I thought I would start today because, again, we're dealing with the topic of radical environmentalism and climate change, and just thinking about what's the way forward with some of this, because I do believe that we shouldn't resist the notion that the climate is changing. When we started this, we talked about the medieval warm period in the the Little Ice Age, and so we have examples of climate fluctuation that have little to do with the burning of fossil fuels and so forth, because climate does just change. Now, what role fossil fuel plays in our current situation is still, I think, not settled science, even though if you listen to the mainline media, they would say it's settled, but I don't think that's actually true. But there might be a role played by fossil fuels. The question becomes, what do you do about that? And is the potential pill worse than the disease? And I think you can make a strong argument that it absolutely is, that adapting to any changes that come along is far preferable to radical alternatives, because all of those alternatives, with the exception of nuclear power, which is culturally unacceptable, those alternatives are pretty costly and perhaps not even really doable. But I thought I'd just read a couple of statements. This is, I read a lot of books by Kindle, so these are my Kindle notes of a book that I read recently, which Lloyd Fergie recommended to me. And just a few quotes here about renewables. We know what renewables are, right? Solar, wind. It says wind farms require roughly 450 times more land than natural gas plants. So if you're going to go in that direction, of course we are in Oregon, right? The amount of land that takes is enormous, 450 times more land. In Germany, they have gone away from nuclear, and they're going in these other directions. So what are the consequences of that? We live in a real world where there's consequences. It says the cost to consumers of renewables has been staggeringly high. Renewables contribute to electricity prices rising 50% in Germany since 2007. So 50% rise as they've gone away from nuclear and they've gone to renewables. German electricity prices were 45% higher than the European average. So as a good example, as a comparison, France has continued to maintain their other traditional sources of power generation, and Germany is now paying 50% more almost because of their going away from that. Here's another one I thought was interesting. If the United States were to try to generate all of the energy it uses with renewables, and this is a pretty big gap, but so it's maybe somewhere between these two, it would require 25 to 50% of all land in the country. So again, if you're going to try to do this with solar or wind, those kinds of technologies, you're going to have to take, let's split in the middle, 1/3 of all the land is going to have to be devoted to windmills or solar wind or solar farms and so forth. If you drive into Pendleton, you notice it says beware of solar gaze, and you come around the corner and there's that. That's a small operation, but it's taking up a significant amount of property, I'm sure, based upon what it actually generates. Does anybody know what that's even used for in Pendleton? I don't know. There's another quote. One pioneering study found that in the case of Germany, where nuclear and hydroelectric dams produced 75 and 35 times more in energy, respectively, than is required to make them. Solar, wind, and biomass produce just 1.6, 3.9, and 3.5 times more. You understand what's being said there? The energy density of something like nuclear or fossil fuels, it's, the payback is great. I mean, the expense to build a plant and what you get as a result is great, whereas these other technologies, not nearly so much. I wanted to read another, did I not mark this? There was some really interesting but apparently in my, oh, here it is. What do you think about nuclear? I mean, nuclear has a really bad reputation with a lot of folks, I realize that. But, when you start, and by the way, the author of this book I would say he's very much a progressive. He's not a conservative person politically. He started life as sort of in Ocasio-Cortez's camp, Green New Deal type individual, and was very interested in preserving endangered species. But then as he really started to just study this more carefully, and as he started to travel into the developing world, and he began to recognize how the first world creates statutes and regulations that keep the developing world in poverty. They talk about like the developing world needs to leap. So right now they're burning wood as a primary source for heat and fuel and so forth, which is very inefficient and deforests entire forests, right? So it's very destructive. So what they need would be a dam for cheap electricity, or they need a coal plant, or a gas plant, or nuclear. But of course, the first world say you can't have those things because of climate change. And so they're saying you need to leapfrog over that and just go straight to wind and solar. But wind and solar can't generate what they need. So we've created incredible wealth in our cultures because we've made use of fossil fuels, and there's tremendous attempt to deny that to these developing countries. So that's where as he got into this and began to travel around the world and to really realize the price being paid by human beings in other countries, that began to really change his thinking on all of this. And he began to realize too that fossil fuels have a downside, but they have an upside, not only in terms of human flourishing, but in terms of how they actually help the environment. Because let's face it, if you're burning wood, that's far more destructive than burning coal. And it's an interesting book. But he talks about nuclear here, and he says, the worst energy accident of all time. What do you think that might be? The worst energy accident of all time. It was in 1975, and it was a dam collapse in China. And I won't try to pronounce the word, but it collapsed and killed 170 to 230,000 people. One dam, I've read about what happened in Hepner, years ago, and the flood there. I thought if that dam broke, Hepner would really be gone. But so this is a dam that killed 200,000 people. And then he writes, it's not that nuclear energy never kills. It's that its death toll is vanishingly small. Here are some annual death totals. This is just interesting. How many people die yearly from walking? You want to take a guess? From walking. I don't know what this means exactly. He doesn't elaborate. Well, Well, I was thinking of my wife. My wife's fallen down several times while walking. She's also had several accidents on bikes, one time while pulling a lawnmower behind her bike, which is not recommended. But the statistics say that 270,000 people die yearly from walking. 270,000. Maybe that means, too, that probably includes people who are out hiking and they're walking on a trail and they fall off the trail. How about driving? How many people die from driving in the course of a year? What's that? Pretty close. Actually, that's remarkably close. 1.35 million. But, you know, I mean, that's...
Is that worldwide?
I assume this is worldwide. I'm sure this is worldwide, yes. So 1.35 million die from driving yearly. So driving's dangerous, right? How about working? How many people die working? I mean, think about a lot of jobs. There's like construction workers. A lot of people died building skyscrapers and so forth, or, well, police officers. I mean, there's lots of dangerous stuff in the world. The number is 2.3 million. This is a really interesting, how many people die annually, according to this statistic, so I don't know how they determined this, but they're saying based from air pollution. How many people die from air pollution? Now, we realize that we live in an exceedingly clean country, don't we? You know, you've probably seen pictures of China where you can't hardly see because of the smog and so forth.
China won't tell us how many people die.
Yeah. Or even if you can imagine, you know, throughout history, you know, walking into a room and there's a fire in there for heat and the amount of smoke that produces, you know. The number here is 4.2 million. 4.2 million people, they say, die yearly from air pollution, or maybe complications of air pollution. I mean, you got asthma. By contrast, nuclear's known death total this is not from a nuclear bomb, obviously. You know, this Hiroshima, and we're not talking about that, but from nuclear power plants, the known death toll is just over 100. Now, that includes Chernobyl. You know, you might have seen the Netflix documentary on Chernobyl here. It was pretty interesting, and actually it's pretty interesting. It's good TV, actually. And they have some suggestions at the end of that where they're saying, you know, but I think according to this source, that's very much exaggerated, as to actually how many people have died from what happened at Chernobyl. So the death toll from nuclear is just over 100. Nuclear is thus the safest way to make reliable electricity. In fact, nuclear has saved more than 2 million lives to date by preventing the deadly air pollution that shortens the lives of millions of people per year. Then he writes, France spends a little more than half as much for electricity that produces 1/10 of the carbon emissions of German electricity. Okay? So Germany has gone away from nuclear because of how everybody's afraid of it, and so consequently they build, say, a gas plant, which is far dirtier, and they're paying much more for electricity, and while polluting at a much higher rate. Another statement, as for nuclear waste, it is the best and safest kind of waste produced from electricity production. It has never hurt anyone, and there is no reason to think that it ever will. When most people refer to nuclear waste, they are referring to the used nuclear fuel rods. After they cool for 2 or 3 years and spent fuel pools in nuclear plants, they are put in steel and concrete canisters and stored on land in a manner known as dry cask storage. This makes nuclear, this is what's interesting, this makes nuclear the only form of electricity that internalizes its waste product. All other forms externalize their waste into the natural environment. You see what they're saying? You know, the waste is put into a safe storage place, whereas all other types of fuels, well, you got a smokestack, or you got, it's going into the atmosphere. They can't have it both ways, said MIT climate scientist Carrie Emanuel. If they say this climate change is apocalyptic or it's an unacceptable risk, which they say that, right? The radical ones do. I mean, the AOCs, we got 12 years left, and we're now 3 years into that prediction, so we got 9 years left. It's apocalyptic. Or the Biden administration says this. I mean, you got John Kerry now as the climate czar, which is a cabinet-level position. We've never had that in the history of the country. And they're talking about this. You've got the 1.5 trillion spending for infrastructure, and you've got the 3.5 additional trillion, and climate change is wrapped up in a lot of that. A lot of AOC's ideas are in all of that, and they're pushing this as climate change is an existential threat to the world. It's a catastrophe. If we don't stop this, we're all in desperate trouble. That's what they say. So do they believe that? Well, this is the point of this climate scientist. If they say that climate change is apocalyptic or it's an unacceptable risk, and then they turn around and rule out the most obvious way of avoiding it, which would be nuclear power, they are not only inconsistent, they're insincere. So, and I don't know, it's interesting, Jerry Brown, Governor of California, he was very opposed to nuclear energy. He managed to close down a lot of nuclear power plants while governor of California. He's been governor over 2 different time frames. His family made most of their money in fossil fuels. So, this is an element too, where in our culture, one group that's really anti-nuclear is the coal and gas industries, because that's a competitor to them. So if you can close down a nuclear plant, then they can build some other type of plant. So just something to think about, and I realize, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, and if you have them, we'd be curious to hear them, but maybe just a different way of thinking, perhaps.
Just a couple of comments. One, Antarctica experienced its coldest winter in years and years and years. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. But also, the other thing in the development of nuclear energy is they're coming up with, you don't have to have these plants the size of ones in Washington or any of them. They're developing very, very small, compact nuclear plants that can serve a huge amount of people. And the other thing, Chernobyl is probably horribly built.
Yeah.
Built by communists who really aren't very good at building. So
yeah, so many of these horrible environmental disasters have been in communist countries. And there's an irony in that, of course, in that the progressive part of our current culture wants to go in a more socialist, communist direction, and you look at the fruit of that. I would listen to a video just yesterday, and this argument is being made that we need to become socialist in the direction of communist, and the other person was saying, but has this ever worked? I mean, think about the Soviet Union, think about Venezuela. This has never worked. And the response was, well, it's never been tried right. And that is the response, but I mean, that's really hard to swallow, isn't it? What's that?
Tried right once in this question. I mean, Israel really was kind of a communist country. The theocracy, very much all about the community, and the world hated it, Washington.
You're talking about the Old Testament? Okay. But we'll look at some of those. Let's table that, because we'll come back to maybe some of that today, actually. I wanted to say something else before we move forward about the precautionary principle. We talked about that last Sunday, and if you remember, the example I used last Sunday was golden rice, which has tremendous benefits to help the developing world. I used a statistic last Sunday that around 670,000 children under the age of 5 die every year in the developing world, and golden rice would save hundreds of thousands of those children. So there's a deficiency in rice, it's a vitamin A deficiency, and golden rice, which is genetically modified to make up that deficit, it also preserves eyesight. There's thousands of children who don't die, but they go blind. And these kinds of technologies are rejected based on what's called the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is the recognition that there are uncertainties with lots of things in life, right? And so better safe than sorry is sort of the rationale behind rejecting something like this. And as I was thinking about it this week, I had an interesting thought that just came to my mind. I was thinking, you know, how could we illustrate the precautionary principle? And now I'm, you know, maybe you know where I'm going with this. But I would hope that as Christians we could have a conversation that wouldn't get nasty. But COVID-19, doesn't the vaccine fit into this category? So there are people, and I'll tell you my view. My view is I'm pro-vaccination, but I'm anti-mandate. I do not believe people should be forced to take the vaccine. But I do think, regardless of how you fall in this, that vaccine fits within this kind of thinking, the precautionary principle, because there's people in our culture who are saying, I don't know what the long-term impact of this is. It hasn't been thoroughly enough vetted. It hasn't gone through the years and years long process with normal vaccines, and therefore I don't want to take this because there perhaps will be down the road some harmful health concern from doing this. Now, and so I think that there's some validity to that, but it's like everything else in life, nothing in the real world is a free lunch. And so, you know, if you choose not to take the vaccine, then there have been people who've died as a result of that. And so, you know, you've got this thinking process. The other issue that comes into this is just, you know, the struggle over in our culture with authority. And is it legitimate for the government to say you have to take this vaccination? And a lot of folks, and I'm very sympathetic with those folks, say, I don't think that's right. And so I just throw that out there today is falling into this. This is just, we live in a real world, right? And the choices in the real world sometimes are difficult. So, I mean, years and years and years ago, Jonathan Edwards, when smallpox was a major disease in this culture, Jonathan Edwards got a smallpox vaccination, and it killed him. Did you know that? Jonathan Edwards was the most brilliant theologian in American history, and he'd been called to be the president of Princeton University, and he took a smallpox vaccination, which at that time was a brand new technology, and he had an adverse reaction to it, and he died. So there would be an example where, boy, Jonathan Edwards, I'm sure, well, Jonathan Edwards went to heaven, so, I mean, from his theological position, to die is gain, right? But we'd say, boy, I'm sure Edwards' family would have said, boy, I sure wish he hadn't taken that vaccination. But he did. So anyway, enough on that unless someone has a thought, and then if not, we'll move on.
I'm wondering if Kavanaugh is wondering if he should have taken the vaccine.
Brett Kavanaugh?
The guy that's on the Supreme Court that took the vaccine, but he still got COVID. Did you read that this week?
Oh, well, he had a breakthrough case? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, you have to ask him that.
Oh, that is sure. Coupon, you might know that.
What's that?
I say all the left is sure after him because, well, they're happy that he got it again, got COVID.
The idea of the vaccine, if you take the vaccine, you can still get COVID, but you won't be hospitalized as a result of it. So it'll be less damage to your physical system from the COVID if you had the vaccine. So it's kind of, if you just because you get the shot doesn't mean you won't get it. It just means that it's going to keep you from getting serious conditions as a result of it. It's going to put you in the hospital.
The other man that died in Stanford here, this whole
Yeah, there's a lot of people who died that have been vaccinated from the vaccine, and they've proven it. Even the CDC is, so.
Yeah, and I'm not here, I hope you don't think I'm here to, I'm not throwing this out to cause a controversy. I actually thought about it, I thought long and hard, should I not even, as I was thinking this week, I thought the precaution principle, how do I illustrate that? I thought, wow, COVID-19 is a pretty good example of this. And I thought, should I not throw that out? But then I thought, gosh, that's got to be wrong if we can't throw this out in church and if we fight like pagans over it. That's got to be wrong, right? It's just wrong.
Anything
So,
oversimplified. You can't just blanket. And precautionary principle can be really abused, and we're not going to do anything because something bad might happen. It can also be you've got to weigh your pros and cons, and for COVID, any vaccine, for example, there have always been people injured by vaccines, and there always will be. And so then you have to weigh, for the individual, it wasn't a better choice. For the majority, and I don't know, it's just like, you can't oversimplify, even when you start reading all the statistics of how many people die walking and working, die firmly believe, and then how many people died from Chernobyl, or, it's like, I want to believe everything I hear, but you get so skeptical anymore that, like, anyone could twist any statistics to suit them. So I think, again, it's just like, let's weigh the pluses and the minuses, and do the pluses outweigh the minuses, knowing that like you said, there is no free lunch. There isn't a perfect way to power our Earth without someone or something. It comes at a cost. Everything does. So
yes.
what has the greatest cost? What has the less cost? I think so.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, I think Maria stated what I'm trying to get at very well and very clearly. In this world, everything has a cost, and there's rarely a perfect decision. But you got to make decisions. And so all of these are examples when every means of trying to power the planet, there are costs. But what is the best among these alternatives? All right? Realizing that in this world, that's just a reality. All right, well, let's talk about something else then. And that's, if you have the notes, it's called the tragedy of the commons. Is this something you're familiar with or not? The tragedy of the commons? Let me read a little bit. The tragedy of the commons is a problem in economics that occurs when individuals neglect the well-being of a public resource in the pursuit of personal gain. This leads to overconsumption and ultimately depletion of the common resource to everyone's detriment. Does that make sense? It's really the idea, if you don't own a resource, you're much more likely to abuse the resource. Isn't that true? I mean, an example of this, I suppose, it's not a natural resource, but the way the government deals with your money. It's a lot easier to spend your money than it is it's a lot easier for the bureaucrat to spend your money than his or her money, right? When you see that with your kids, don't you? Your kids are very willing to spend your money, but when it comes to their own money, all of a sudden they become far better stewards. And so we're really talking about stewardship and how do you best steward a resource? And so the question is, do you best steward a resource by having no one own it, Or do you best steward a resource through private ownership? Okay? Here'd be a great example in American history, and you all know this. What is an animal in American history that was nearly exterminated?
Bison.
Bison. Okay? No one owned the bison, so just shoot one more. Okay? Contrary to popular thinking, private ownership of property is the best way to preserve a resource. When a resource is not owned by anyone, but used by everyone, the tendency is to disregard the long-term well-being of the resource in order to gain the most short-term benefit possible. In our own nation's history, consider the wholesale slaughter of the American buffalo. Because no one owned the buffalo, everyone was free to exploit them for personal profit, the result being the near extinction of the species. The principle here is that with ownership comes responsible stewardship. So here's a question for you. Does the Bible support the idea of private ownership? And if so, give me some verses where that would be demonstrated. Does the Bible, now this gets into economic systems, doesn't it? Because in capitalism, private ownership is kind of core to that system. In communism, the state owns everything, and private ownership doesn't really exist. And socialism, depending on the version of it, you know, it's sort of an amalgam. Maybe the state owns all the businesses or the factories, but you can still own your own home. In purist communism, you don't even own your home. You don't own anything. But in capitalism, it's really rooted on the idea of private ownership of property, whether it's the factory or your home. So is that biblical? That's the question. And if it is biblical, show it to me in the Bible.
Well, God gives Abraham a lot of land.
Yeah? At least he makes promises of land that Abraham will someday own, yes. But there's a nation called Israel which is given to that group of people, yeah?
And each family was allotted a certain amount of land, wasn't they?
What's that?
Each family was allotted a certain amount of land, I think. Each tribe was, really.
Well, the tribes are, mm-hmm.
And I'm sure they allotted the family a certain amount of land, because every 7 years, we set them.
Yes, so that's actually getting in, you're going in the right direction, the year of Jubilee, and where land would return to its original owners and so forth, sort of a balancing aspect within their economic system.
And we're allowed to own people up until the year of Jubilee. Past the year of Jubilee, as long as they voluntarily chose to remain with you, and you would put them all for their year in your home, and they were a permanent slave, of course, for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I'd prefer almost like indentured servitude, but there were ways if you fell into debt that you could hire yourself out. There would be a legal obligation for your labor, and you would be as sort of an indentured servant until the year of Jubilee. And if you wanted to remain in that state, there was a provision for that as well. So it's not a complete ownership. But there's some things in the Bible that is even more basic than this.
I like Jesus' parable about going, the man who went out to hire people, first thing in the morning, mid-morning, mid-afternoon. And he said, what does it matter to you how much I pay, as long as I agree to pay? And that's a really good example of capitalism, where you have the freedom to hire people.
Yeah. What do we have in Exodus chapter 20? 10 Commandments. Are there any commandments that have to do with the idea of owning private property? Yeah. I mean, it's, I don't know which of the commandments it is. Is it, what, 6 or 7 or 8? You shall not steal. Or thou shalt not covet. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, his servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything else that is your neighbor's. And so both of those commandments, implicit within it, of course, it's an implicit argument. You can't steal something unless somebody else owns it, right? And you can't covet something unless someone else owns it and it's not yours and you don't have a legal right to it and so forth. And so at least 2 of the 10 Commandments deal rather directly with this idea. So implicit here is the idea of private property and private ownership and the rights to private property and the right to use that property as you see fit, and to have a system in place where that property cannot be taken from you or stolen from you. Okay? So in pure communism, the 10 Commandments here about steal and covet would sort of be irrelevant because you don't own anything anyway. Another text that does come to my mind, along with some of the things that you've said, but in Acts chapter 5. So if you have a Bible and you want to turn to Acts chapter 5, it's an interesting story. You know this story. It is one of those stories in the New Testament that kind of awakens us. There was someone many, many centuries ago called Marcion, and Marcion was a heretic. I'm talking 1,800 years ago or thereabouts. And Marcion had a theological conviction which was rejected as heretical, but it was the idea that really the Bible talks about 2 gods. There's the God of the Old Testament, and there's the God of the New Testament. Now, could you imagine where he went with this? The God of the Old Testament, is he nice or kind of mean?
Big meaner.
He's a big meaner, right? And the God of the New Testament, is he nice or mean? He's a lot nicer than that Old Testament God. And so Marcion had this idea that there's really 2 gods in the Bible. The God of the Old Testament is a rather nasty fellow. And so Marcion just sort of erased the Old Testament from, he created a canon. For those of you coming Sunday evening, he had a canon and the Old Testament was out. And so it's passages like Acts 5 that help us actually, because in this text, God takes pretty swift action against Ananias and Sapphira. He strikes them down. And by the way, there's also the book of Revelation in the New Testament, which, is if you want to talk about judgment, wow. But here's the passage. A man named Ananias with his wife Sapphira sold a piece of property, and with his wife's knowledge, he kept back for himself some of the proceeds and brought only a part of it and laid it at the apostles' feet. And so the story is that they sold property, and they came to the church and they said, we sold the property for $50,000 and we're giving a $50,000 donation to your building fund. But actually they sold the property for $200,000, and so they gave a portion to the church. So Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back for yourself part of the proceeds of the sale? It's verse 4 that's most relevant. While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal? Why is it that you have contrived this deed in your heart? You have not lied to man, but to God. When Ananias heard this, he fell down, breathed his last, and great fear came upon all who heard of it. And his wife comes in 3 hours later, repeats the story, and says the young men had just finished burying Ananias, and so they come back for some refreshments, and they have to go bury his wife. Now, why are they put to death by God? Because they lied, right?
They didn't have to give any of it.
They did not have to give any of it, and Peter is very specific in saying the property was your own, and you were free to do with that property anything that you chose to do with it. Because, again, implicit within this is the idea of private property, and that there's a sacred right to do with your property as you see fit. So the problem is that they lied. It's the deceitfulness, it's the pride that reveals. They're claiming to be far more generous than they are. But this text does suggest the idea, the value of private property. And so I do think, and you could look at other passages where, from a biblical perspective, that does tend in the direction of capitalism, where private property is a high value. And it relates to this discussion because of the tragedy of the commons is the idea that when you don't own a resource, you're much more likely to abuse that resource. Does that make sense? That's just true, isn't it? So it's been suggested that one way to help endangered species would be to, say, in a third world country, a developing world country, and you've got some species, maybe it's a cat of some sort, and this cat is endangered. The best thing you could do, well, what should you do in that situation? How do you protect the cat? What would you say? Maybe it's the tigers in some part of the world. How would you protect the resource? Do you value, should we allow tigers to go extinct? Anybody think we should? We got no takers for that. So we're all on the same page here. Tigers are worth protecting.
Well, why are they going extinct?
Well, tell me.
Well, I don't know. Their habitats being burned down or used or farmed or...
That's part of the problem in certain instances.
Tiger bugs are so in this season.
poaching.
They are sometimes poached because of, value of various parts, and I mean, we've probably read some of that.
They're still hunted, legally too.
Yeah, should we allow for the legal hunting of some of these animals? And if we should, then how would we do that in a responsible way? What's that?
Put a limit on how many you can kill.
Yeah, so one of the suggestions is that what you could do in some of these situations is just simply give that resource to the native peoples. Maybe there's a tribe. Give the tigers to that tribe. And tell that tribe, you can allow really wealthy Westerners to come here and shoot a tiger. And you can charge $100,000 or more for every animal harvested. Now, what will that tribe do if they're given that as a resource?
You're going to make it last.
Yeah, it incentivizes them to protect the resource, because if they protect it, over the long run, they stand to make significant money by doing so. Now, will this work in every situation? I'm not necessarily suggesting it will. But if you can take a resource that is endangered and incentivize its protection because you give them ownership over it, this is one way to avoid what's called the tragedy of the commons. If no one owns it, everybody's going to just exploit it. Okay? Does that make sense?
Now if I own it, I'm going to protect it and make it, and so I'm going to look at what's killing the tigers. Is it my forest management? Is it my shopping malls? What is it? Is it the hunting? And then I'm going to...
Or if the tribe owns it and the poachers come in and shoot tigers, the tribe's probably going to deal with those poachers because they now have an economic incentive for doing so. What tends to happen is that the Westerners come in, so white people come into an African village and say, if you touch that animal, we're going to destroy you. And so the animal ends up having more rights than the villager does. And the villagers, therefore, have deep resentments. So the animal comes in and is poaching the villager's food. And the villager has no recourse for this. I can't feed my kids because the baboons stole my crop. If you could turn that upside down and say, that village now owns those baboons, and you can charge Westerners to come look at your baboons. And if you can incentivize that in some way, they will protect the resource because it's in their own best interest to do so. You're going to say something, Will.
So, a lot of the reason why tigers have been killed in Asia was the fact that their oils from their fat and their liver have been used in health medicine, natural health medicine. And it's been going on for years. There's been a lot of organizations trying to stop it over the years. Mm-hmm. And that's a big one, too.
Mm-hmm. So we talked last Sunday, what saved whales? Fossil fuels. As whales were harvested almost to extinction because of the oil, and fossil fuel is a denser resource. It's a higher energy resource. But, of course, in the sea, it's harder the tragedy of the commons is you can't fence off the sea, right? Barbed wire helps in a lot of this. You can actually fence off a resource. With whales, it's harder to do that. But anyway, that's just something to think about. And then finally, as we will end this, capitalism is an engine for responsible development and for a cleaner world. Now, that's totally contrary to what so much of the culture is telling us. Capitalism is the problem, isn't it? We got to get rid of capitalism because, it's the greedy capitalists and they're exploiting the world and so forth. And just simply, the facts don't support that. The opposite is actually more true. So capitalism creates incredible wealth and establishes the circumstances out of which environmental protections become possible. Wealthy countries have the luxury of creation care, and the citizens in those countries actually demand a clean environment for themselves and for their children. The track record on this is very clear. Most of the serious environmental challenges we face today are directly connected to one thing. And what is that? If you fill in the blank. Most of the serious environmental challenges we face today are directly connected to poverty. That's the answer, poverty. Poverty creates the degradation of creation.
If I get more money from tiger oil than I do from tiger tourism, I'm going to choose tiger oil. Black market.
Or just think about plastic. Why is it that the oceans have a lot of plastic in them? Where does that plastic come from?
Vietnam.
What's coming from, the point I'm trying to make is that if you have a system of garbage collection, you collect your garbage, it goes to the landfill, and that's good for the environment. If you don't have a system of garbage collection, and who doesn't have that? The poor countries of the world. What do you do with your garbage? Yeah. Hobbes and Caesar aren't here today, so I can talk about them. But when they came to the United States, there were a few moments when I was just like I just wanted to hide my face in shame. They were 7 and 10, and they were the kind of kids that would roll down the windows and throw their garbage out the van. It was virtually that bad. I'm really not exaggerating this. And it took a long time to try to, you can't do that.
Stopping the van, turning around, driving back to collect the garbage.
But, they had grown up in Ethiopia, they'd grown up in a mud hut, they'd grown up without electricity, they'd grown up without any of those services that we take for granted. So, what do you do with your junk? You just huck it. And so in wealthy countries where you have something as simple as the garbage man, that creates environmental health, but that's a luxury that much of the world simply doesn't have. And so we've got this issue with plastics and plastics in the ocean, and I don't know where that's all coming from. I mean, China was mentioned, but I think it's coming from poverty ultimately.
It's Asia.
I just saw a list of where the plastic was coming from, and the United States was almost non-existent, and it seemed like the top countries were all, with one exception, were all Asia. And because they have the best access to oceans.
Densely populated, is not a lot of land mass.
Yeah, and there could be other factors. There could be worldview factors like, I mean, if your worldview was, if your belief system, your presupposition was, the world is a trash can, let's trash it, well, you probably would trash it. But I think, the average human response is, I want a clean environment if I can have it. And so that's why we develop the garbage services and so forth. But that's a luxury of the wealthy. Yeah, Dan?
Just so, I wanted to say something about first world, influences on third world in relation to poverty. There's a really, this is something related but somewhat side. Haiti is such a fabulous example of how the United States really ruined Haitian farmers, and this goes back to Clinton following one of their natural disasters. But we dumped so much rice on Haiti in an effort to help them. That it put Haitian rice farmers all went out of business because there was just, they had no possible way of making money growing their own rice. And we did it long enough that it ruined their own farming. And all because we were helping. And there's a lot of things that first world countries do that help.
Yeah, at least that one is a benevolent mistake.
It is, but
it's less, yeah.
Americans, there's a lot of things we do without thinking.
Yeah, there's two good books on this. When Helping Hurts is one. There's another book called Toxic Charity, which has a very similar theme. Yeah. Okay, well, let me keep reading. The track record is very clear. Most of the serious environmental challenges we face today are directly connected to poverty. So here's some examples. Poor farmers clear away rainforests because they need farmland that is not depleted by poor farming techniques, and the only way for them to get the land is through deforestation. So what do they need? They need fertilizers, they need modern irrigation systems. Wealthy countries demand high environmental standards because a clean environment is a luxury, and that they not only desire, but they demand. This insight means that the environmental movement needs to understand that responsible capitalism is a friend to their cause, not the enemy that needs to be destroyed. Okay? So if the problem is poverty, if that's really what's creating most of the environmental damage in the world, then the solution to that is wealth, and you can't have wealth at this point without the burning of fossil fuels, or nuclear, or some combination of all the above. So to deprive the developing world of those technologies guarantees they remain in poverty, which guarantees that the planet will be degraded. Development of public land is often stifled by environmentalists because they are not made to feel the opportunity costs of their policies. Just going back to the tragedy of the commons, and here's some hypocrisy I'm about to read to you. For example, the Audubon Society has for many years allowed for oil and gas production in their privately owned Rainy Preserve in Louisiana. Did you know that? The Audubon Society has gotten very radical. They're very much against fossil fuels. But they allow for drilling on their own property. Okay, that's kind of hypocritical, don't you think? At the same time, the Audubon Society and similar groups are militantly opposed to any drilling in, say, example, Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Reserve because of perceived fears of environmental damage. Well, now you got the precautionary principle, you know, what are the unintended consequences of this? So the question, why would a prestigious environmental group like Audubon allow greedy oil and gas producers to drill in their property? What's the answer? Because they heap financial benefits, I mean millions and millions and millions in royalties by allowing oil and gas producers access to their environmentally sensitive lands. The salient point here is that opportunity costs matter. When Audubon was forced to consider the opportunity costs associated with saying no to development, they determined that the costs were too high and allowed for drilling. And by the way, they've been done in a very economic or environmentally responsible way. Conversely, though, because ANWR, you know, the Arctic Reserve, is part of the Federal Reserve, no individual company or organization is made to feel those same costs. One wonders what might happen if Alaska's North Slope were owned by the Audubon Society. We cannot bifurcate wealth from environmental stewardship. Affluence is not the enemy of the environment. Poverty is. Markets create wealth, and the creation of wealth produces resources and the will to improve the environment.
You know, John, what comes to mind is if you simply say, follow the money, applies in this instance of what's taking place. The abuse of it, also in this instance, the development of the poverty-stricken countries. The other thing that's very interesting here is take a look at the net worth of the politicians in Washington, D.C. and how it grows once they take office. There are specific laws concerning insider trading that a person, a stockbroker, has to abide by. And there's specific laws for all of our senators and congressmen. However, they trade outside of that knowledge by having their spouses or a firm that receives that insider knowledge to become wealthy based on a lot of the things that you're talking about today. Mm-hmm. And recently, well, I think it was this morning, Nancy Pelosi was revealing what her net worth was.
Which is quadrupled in the last several years.
It's going wild.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, and this is one of the things that I think might be really a cool thing that would happen, is they're talking about doing away with the step-up basis, which would create some tax ramifications that are horrendous in our country. I don't think that it'll get anywhere because of what it would do to our elected officials. Mm-hmm. And they would give up millions if the step-up basis provision was taken away.
Yeah. So this is a good segue to tell you that we don't have the details of this. I'm hoping and assuming it'll take place during Sunday school. In the next couple of months, we're going to give Kelly 3 or 4 Sundays to talk about estate planning and wills and trusts and I don't know what all, but to just help people of all ages, because young people need to understand these things. What a benefit for young people to actually understand, like investing early and so forth. But Kelly spent his professional life in that world, and so we're figuring out a time where we're going to give him 3 or 4 Sundays to just help us. And for those of you at the other end of life, you know, do you have things in order financially? And so, you want to say anything more about that?
Well, estate planning is a very broad topic. I always have to give the disclaimer, I am not an attorney, but just dealing with attorneys over my career with all sorts of trusts and wills and special needs trusts and how to get past probate and all those things. It is a labyrinth of laws that we have to be aware of, just to give you a practical method whereby you can help your family through all of this without really putting the burden on people.
Yeah. All right, well, we're done for today. The takeaway from this whole discussion of how many weeks this has been, I think, the big takeaway I would want you to take is this. Wealth is not the enemy of the environment. It is the environment's best friend. And you even see that if you're just driving through a town and you drive past the wealthy big homes, they're usually the ones that are really manicured, really kept up, really nice, right? And that's true all the way around. It takes wealth to produce a clean environment. And if you don't have wealth, you've got a problem. So that's total opposite of what our culture is telling us right now. So stand up for the capitalistic system, realizing that there's great benefits in it. Can I have you, Kelly, would you close?